Today I wanted to talk about this book. So I've had this for years. This is Cinder. It's the first book in the Lunar Chronicles series. This is by Marissa Meyer. It's like kind of old. It's, I think, now 10 years old, but I originally bought this when it was really popular back in the day, and I read the first book, got halfway through the second one, lost it. Then I started it up again when I found it, read this one, read the second about halfway through again, and then I lost it again. This time we're actually finishing them. So the premise for this book, if you haven't heard of this one yet, the basic idea is that we are doing a somewhat creative retelling of classic stories. Obviously Cinder is going to be Cinderella, the shoe, obviously, and the name, except it's different. And honestly, I liked the way the author went about this. We have little snippets of like kind of the original tale, and then she jumps in with where the story kind of somewhat ties into that, which I thought was really fun. So the basic premise of this book is that Cinder is a cyborg. So she was human, she got into an accident, and modern technology allowed for them to create robot parts to replace the ones that don't work. And when that happens, they add a bunch of programming into your brain, and shockingly, people don't love that and they get really offended and don't like to be around cyborgs. Which is interesting to think of, how in a futuristic society that would be an issue for people to have aids that would help them to function. But anyways, Cinder is a mechanic. Obviously being a cyborg, that would be a handy thing to know. So she just kind of is the mechanic at 16. She's adopted. She has her two stepsisters and her stepmom, and then the father figure had passed away years ago, and so all she's really known is the stepmom and the stepsisters. She also has a little sidekick, which is an android. That is the stereotypical, like, Data is what I kept picturing, of like these robot things that go around. And obviously they probably don't look like Data, like from Star Trek, but they have more of a personality for a lot of them. And like they have like a personality chip. And so she's got her little sidekick that helps with her mechanic things and just kind of is her friend, because nobody wants to be friends with a cyborg. The book does switch point of view. So we get Cinder's point of view, and then we also get it from the prince. Now the prince is going to eventually be the ruler for New Beijing. His dad is the current emperor, and then he's next in line. And so obviously being a prince, it's fun to see how a prince is going to handle things, because the land has a plague. It was really freaky, honestly, to be reading this while we've gone through our own plague recently. So it's like, oh, they're in the quarantines, and you're like, oh. Like, the stuff that like the author came up with for this was really eerie to read about post-pandemic. And like, obviously we didn't go to the extremes that this book does, because our plague did not manifest the same way as this one. This was a lot closer to the Black Death. The other thing about this book that is a little different is that the moon is now like a legit planet and has its own customs, and it has a queen and a society, and that there's the threat of war with them. And so that's kind of it for the like non-spoiler stuff for this book. Honestly, if any of that sounds interesting to you, go ahead and pick up this book. This is not the super teenage, really boring to read as an adult kind of a book. It doesn't feel so emphasized that she's 16 and it's the 16-year-olds' things that they're interested in. She's very mature for a 16-year-old. And so if you love anything fantasy, sci-fi, just an adventure, this is a really easy read, and I absolutely loved it. Now onto a little bit more of the spoiler section. So the thing is with this book, I have read it many times, and I knew from the very first time I read it, every time it comes up, the second they talk about the princess, you know it's Cinder. And I don't think that's a bad thing, because sometimes it's okay to really play into the tropes of writing, because there's this weird excitement that you get waiting for the thing to happen that you know is going to happen, and you're just waiting for that moment every page you read. And I didn't mind it. I was excited to get to the point where she gets to learn that she's the princess, that she's actually a lunar, and that the horrible accident that happened to the princess actually happened to her. Like, I really love how it came about, and obviously a lot of people noticed it really quick, where you're like, oh, that's what's gonna happen. But I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't mind having books that follow a classic trope. They're tropes for a reason. People like them. Same thing with the prince. His dad's sick. We know he's going to become emperor. We know that he's gonna have issues with the Lunar Queen and that he's gonna be a problem and that he's gonna have to deal with it. And you know that eventually him and Cinder are gonna have a complicated relationship because, like, obviously, if she's gonna be the princess, like, it's gonna, obviously that's further down the books, I assume. But, like, it's just interesting to see these tropes starting to play out that you know are gonna happen, and you're just waiting for them to happen. And you're like, how is it gonna happen though? I don't mind that. Honestly, it's kind of refreshing. Instead of having to constantly worry about plot twists, it's nice to see the twist coming up the road. So this book was really, really fantastic. I loved it so much. I haven't had a book that I actually would stay up to finish reading in so long. So, like, for example, in 2020, I read one fiction book the entire time. And that says something, because I used to read so much, and granted, having worked regular, horrible jobs, you don't have a lot of free time to read, which now I do, being a full-time author and creator. Like, I have the time to do it, so obviously now I'm reading a lot more. But, like, I only read the one book last year, and I didn't want to. It was I think it was like 2 years it took me to read that book, because it was just so boring. I didn't care about any of the characters. The only interesting character was like some side character that kind of came and went, but really wasn't that big in the story. And, like, I didn't really like the main character. I didn't like the supporting characters. I didn't really care about the plot. Like, it's just really hard to get through those books. And so, because it's not a YA book where we want fast pace. It was traditional fantasy, high fantasy. So it, like, drags feet. And, like, it wasn't my thing. This book, on the other hand, it did take a little bit to get into. Like, it wasn't terrible, but again, like, it's just one of those things where, like, I haven't read fiction books for so long that I'm like, okay. It's a shift from reading the many, many witchcraft books that I normally read and the review process that I do for those, instead of just reading a book to read a story. It was so different, so I was like, this feels weird. And then I read probably like 5 chapters or something, because they're pretty short chapters. So I read a few chapters one night, and then I was like, okay. And then in the morning I was like, I could read a little bit more. And so I read like half of the remaining part of the book. And then that night I sat down and I was like, well, I'll just read a couple chapters before I go to bed. And then I finished the book. And I haven't done that in so long, where you choose reading over sleep. And it was so amazing. Like, I miss that so much, because there's so many books that I'll read that it's like, you don't stay up to read it. It's not something that you're like, I gotta know the answers. Now, granted, witchcraft books are not aimed to do that. They're informative. So it's not like a page turner that you're like, oh my god, I gotta know what happens. But the other fiction books I've read recently also haven't really been that. And this book was. This was fantastic. This is, like, if you haven't read in a very long time, this is a fantastic gateway back into the world of reading. So overall, obviously, I loved this book, and I don't know how quickly I'll be getting through the rest of the books, but I do have them all. I don't have, like, the graphic novels or anything like that, but I have, like, the standard ones. I think there's 6, because we've got Cinder, Scarlet, Cress, Fairest, Winter, and I think it's, like, Stars Above. Actually, it's, yeah, Stars Above. It's on a shelf you can't see, but it is there. So I have all of the books, and so I'll be reading through these, but I'm very excited for these because they're just, like, they're so much fun. And obviously, like, a minor spoiler for the next one, because I'm starting it, it's hard to get into because that was one of the things that the previous times I've tried to get through this series I get bored with. And, like, knowing that helps when you go through the series. It's gonna change point of view. No longer are we talking about Cinder. It's not her point of view no more. We've changed into Scarlet, obviously, because the next book is called Scarlet. So it's gonna be her point of view and her story, and, like, it's just like a shift. And when I had first read these the few times, I was like, I don't want to learn a new character. I want to know what happens. With this one that left on such a cliffhanger, she's trying to escape a freaking prison. Like, I want to know. I don't care about you delivering tomatoes, which is literally how Scarlet starts, is she's delivering tomatoes. So I'm like, the struggle was real. But I think knowing that and like maybe just having a little bit more patience, because what I'm doing is I read this and then I've read a couple of the witchcraft books and then I'm reading the next sequel. So like having a little bit of space between them I think helped a bit. But yeah, these are so fantastic. If you have struggled to get back into reading, these are a great gateway back in. The characters are like interesting, the world is different, but it's not such a high fantasy that it kind of feels like really hard to get into. I also like that it's not set back in time. Like it's kind of nice and refreshing to have something in the future, but not like too futuristic. So anyways, that is going to be it for this book review. Definitely go grab a copy of this. It's old, but people are still reading it. Like, so my husband listens to audiobooks. I read physical books. And he was like, well, I'll listen to the audiobook. And then he went to like the Libby or whatever and signed in to put a hold. And there's like 12 holds for the audiobook ahead of him. So like people are still loving this book like 10 years later. So obviously something went right with this book. So definitely go get yourself a copy of it, whether it's from the library or if you find a copy at a used bookstore or go buy it somewhere. This is phenomenal. So that is going to be it for this book chat. I would love to hear your thoughts on this one in the comments down below. Make sure to like and subscribe. I post every other day. And until next time, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all soon.